All right, and welcome to those of you joining us on YouTube as well. On the TCF side of things, we want to thank Itasca Bank for sponsoring this webinar. Sponsors like Itasca Bank help us to keep these webinars free for everybody. Contact me for more information on sponsoring. You can also help us to keep these webinars free. At the end, you're going to be taken to a page with a whole bunch of resources of things you might be interested in, such as our native plant guide, rain barrel information, and so much more, including our virtual tip jar. So if you're enjoying these webinars, I do encourage you to donate to help TCF continue to do all of the awesome stuff we do, because we do so much more than just webinars. You can also check the box to become a member so you can enjoy our wide variety of members only stuff, such as the hike I led last week at Lake Renwick. That was very cool. It was a gorgeous day and really a beautiful hike out there. So please do become members and you can see all the great stuff that we've got in store for you. All right. We have been doing these webinars every week for over the last year. So coming up next week, we will be talking about native plants, soil health, and stream bank management with our friends at NCAP. That'll be a really great one. They really know their stuff when it comes to soil health, stream bank, keeping it, preventing erosion, all that kind of stuff. They're great. And then on June 23rd, mark your calendars. We will be talking about landscaping your yard with native plants, but I will be joined by Kelsey Shaw from Possibility Place. He is the guy to talk to about native plants. So if you want to put native plants in your yard, if you want to learn more about putting native plants in your yard, June 23rd, do not miss it. All right. So with that, then I am going to turn it over to our friend Kris Lah with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I am very excited to hear about this. I always love learning more about endangered species and new things like that. So without any further ado, take it away, Kris.
Great, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to present, and thank you for all of you who are joining us on this nice warm day that we're having. And yeah, I completely agree. Boy, do we need the rain. I really hope that happens soon. It seems to get forecasted and then just disappears. So yeah, I'd like to start out with this slide so that, well, for a couple reasons, I guess. One, it obviously highlights that there's a lot of endangered species in Northeast Illinois. That map pertains to state endangered species. I'm going to be talking about federally endangered species. And then, of course, the high number of Illinois Natural Areas Inventory sites that are in Northeast Illinois as well. I also show it because as a federal employee, when I go to trainings and meetings and conferences and things like that in other parts of the country, even people in my own agency are surprised to hear that we have an office in Chicago in Northeast Illinois. And sometimes, unfortunately, I get comments like, why? And this map, these maps really kind of explain why. We've got some really rich areas in Northeast Illinois and definitely different and unique ecosystems that support these endangered species. So just thought I'd highlight those. Let's see here. There we go. So I just thought I'd go over, show you some of these endangered species really quickly that we'll be talking about today. The first one is the Eastern Prairie Fringed Orchid. That's the spotted turtle, the rusty-patched bumblebee, the whooping crane, sheepnose mussel, prairie bush clover, Blanding's turtle, pitcher's thistle, Hines emerald dragonfly, lakeside daisy, bald eagle, Rufa red knot, Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, Karner blue butterfly, Monarch butterfly, northern long-eared bat, leafy prairie clover, Mead's milkweed, piping plover, peregrine falcon, and American bumblebee. So we have a lot to cover. I'll try to not speak too quickly, but I do have a lot to cover. So we'll save the questions for the end and look forward to talking to you some more about any questions that you might have. So I'm going to talk to you today about recovered species, extirpated species, candidate and petition species, threatened species, and endangered species. And what does that mean? What do those different categories mean? So species can be put on the federal endangered species list and by people petitioning us. So anybody in the US can petition us to list a species. When we receive those petitions, they get put on a list, a schedule. And then we start that review at that time. Sometimes there's emergency listing actions, and those can be because the species is likely in very bad shape, and we need to think about listing it quickly. But typically, this is how it happens. When we start looking at the petition, not when we receive the petition, but when we start looking at it, when it makes it on the schedule, we do what's called a 90-day review. That's somewhat of a low bar, I'll say, in that for it to move forward. So the petitions that move forward are those that contain substantial information that suggests that maybe the species should be listed. And the petitioner has covered all the details in there that we asked for in the petition. One of the main things is the 5 factors that we look at for listing species and how it's threatened, in the immediacy of those threats. And then if the species makes it past that substantial point, that review, then it'll get put on a schedule for a 12-month review, or what we call status review. Sometimes those can take longer. Sometimes we do those in a little bit different ways. Typically, we try to get those done in 12 months. And then at the end of that, there'll be one of 3 decisions made. One, either it's not warranted for listing, and that's where the process starts, or it's warranted for listing, and it moves forward in the listing process, or it's warranted and precluded, which means it's warranted for listing, but there's other species that we have greater urgency for. So those are given higher priority, and these other ones are kind of put back on what we call more of a candidate list. And so then if the species is still going through the review process, then the portions that you see down at the bottom of this graph here, we start looking at how it should be listed, and whether it should be listed as threatened or endangered, and those kind of things. And there's a whole regulatory process for that, including public comment. All right, so first I wanted to talk to you about recovered species. So one that was mentioned already is the bald eagle. The bald eagle was down to just 417 breeding pairs in 1963. When it was taken off the endangered species list in 2007, there were 9,789 breeding pairs. The 2020 estimate for the lower 48 is 71,467 breeding pairs. In 2004, we got the first nest in Chicago proper in over 100 years along the Calumet River. And now we have 30 nests in Northeast Illinois alone. So the bald eagle is really recovered well and is adapting very well to human activity. It's still a protected species in that it's protected under the Lacey Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. The peregrine falcon is another one that's been taken off the endangered species list. That's its natural habitat there, those cliffs, but they have adapted pretty well to urban areas. This is pictures here of a Chicago Housing Authority building where I used to monitor peregrine falcons. And they take advantages of these deep ledges that are there, as well as hack boxes that have been put out for the species. The species also was not doing well either. As far back as the 40s rather. In 51 was the last recorded nest in Illinois, and until there was actions taken. And eventually DDT was banned, the species was put on the federal endangered species list. Hack boxes started getting put out throughout the eastern United States, including in the Midwest and Chicago in the 80s. Then the species was taken off the federal list in 1999 and off the state list in 2015. But it's still protected as well under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So some species that are extirpated from Northeast Illinois that are still on the threatened endangered species list. So they're not extinct, they just no longer occur in Northeast Illinois. One of them is the Karner blue butterfly, pictured here. It's an endangered species, very small, just has a 1-inch wingspan, found in oak savannas and pine barrens. Part of the reason that it's listed is because of overcollection, and certainly the reason we think it's been extirpated from Northeast Illinois. Habitat restoration is still ongoing. In fact, this is a picture here up at Illinois Beach State Park where lupin was planted. Lupin is its host plant for the larvae. It's a sole food source. It's a disturbance-dependent species, so it does need fire, and it grows in these sandy soils, typically among oaks in our area. Mead's milkweed is another species that no longer occurs in Northeast Illinois, although it does occur at Morton Arboretum, but outside of there does not occur in Northeast Illinois. It's a federally threatened species, and it can be found down in the Shawnee National Forest in southern Illinois. This is the range of the species. The stronghold certainly is in Kansas. However, even there, a lot of those populations occur on private land, many of them that are hay meadows. Actually, this is a time of year where they're going to start mowing or haying those fields. The hay is harvested at this time of year because of high protein content that's used for very expensive horses and things like that. So the private landowners have an interest in haying at this time of year. But what that does is it prevents the species from flowering, or at least the flowers from setting seed. And so what ends up happening is we end up with these clones of the species, and so the genetics tends to be very low even in these hay meadows. So it's an interesting species for sure. As I noted there are reintroduction efforts ongoing for that species. I want to talk to you some about petitioned and candidate species. So again, petition species are species that people have petitioned us to list, and candidate species are species that we've determined are warranted for listing. So the Blanding's turtle is one that we've been petitioned to list. It is a state endangered species in Illinois, and right now we've gotten past that 90-day stage. So we've received the petition, reviewed it. It was substantial. So now we're moving on to that 12-month finding stage. We're really doing a very thorough status assessment on the species. It's a wide-ranging species, so it's an enormous effort to do the status assessment, and we're getting assistance from places like even Texas A&M with that status assessment. And one of the challenges that Jamie and I were talking about with endangered species before the call is locality information. And that's one of the things that we're struggling with doing a status assessment on this species. It has been extirpated from 11 Illinois counties, but there are a lot of efforts underway already in Illinois to recover the species. This is more or less its range. This map's a few years old now, but I think it's still pretty relevant or up to date. So that gives you kind of an idea how they're doing right now in Illinois. The spotted turtle is another species that we have been petitioned to list. It's state endangered as well. And it's on the schedule, like the Blanding's turtle, I believe, to make to finish the petition, or to finish the 12-month finding by 2023, and then make a proposal or determine that it's not warranted for listing. What's interesting I find about the two species is that in Illinois, the Blanding's turtle is doing better than the spotted turtle. But it's the inverse, if you will, range-wide, where the Blanding's turtle seems to not be doing as well as the spotted turtle range-wide. So we'll see what happens when it comes to listing. Illinois is also the western limit for the spotted turtles, so that might be another reason why it's kind of more limited here in Illinois, with just two sites, two places in the lower Des Plaines that are known about. It's pretty limited in the type of habitat that it will use as well. The monarch butterfly is a species that we've been petitioned to list. We've gone through the 12-month finding. It's not on the state endangered species list. And I mentioned that here in part 2 because Illinois, this isn't the case in all states, but in Illinois, when a species is put on the federal list, it's automatically put on the state list. Typically, though, species are on state lists before they're on the federal list. You know, the states recognize, hey, this species isn't doing well in our state, but that's not always the case. And so the monarch is one of these where we've been petitioned to list it. We did go through this 12-month finding. It was found to be warranted for listing, but precluded by higher priority listing actions. So we're definitely keeping a good eye on that species. We are working on things like candidate conservation agreements with people so that that species is, you know, like habitat in particular is getting managed and taken care of and restored as well. So that's one of the things that's being done here. That our area is really important for the monarch butterfly. It, you know, it does have this large, wide range. There's these 3 different populations. Ours overwinters in Mexico, and but the Midwest is really important for the species for breeding, for making sure that it has all the resources it needs to make that long migration back. And most of you probably know that they're highly dependent on milkweeds. So if you can, plant milkweeds. And so there are efforts underway going back to 2014 at the federal level. There's been efforts underway, starting with President Obama, working with the President of Mexico and the Prime Minister of Canada. There were things put forward at that time, not just for the monarch, but for other pollinator species to address, including a national pollinator strategy, and a lot of funding started being put forward for monarch and other pollinator species, particularly for habitat restoration. We announced a monarch strategy back in 2015. which is online. I suggest taking a look at it. There's all things in there that people can do as individuals, industry, and agriculture we're working with, as well as those that manage right-of-ways. So ComEd, for example, is a real active partner and has signed on to one of these candidate conservation agreements that I mentioned, so that they're managing their right-of-ways to benefit the monarch. So really, really good thing. And we're hoping to get many, many more right-of-way managers to take care of the species. When you see somebody like ComEd owns, I believe it's 90,000 miles of right-of-way just in Illinois, you can imagine the conservation opportunities that might be there. The American bumblebee is a species that we were recently listed, or petitioned to list. It's also not on the Illinois threatened endangered species list. We did just get this petition, so we're at the stage where we're looking at the petitions that we've received and determining if the information in there is substantial or not. But we do know that this species has declined. That's well documented, or pretty well documented already, as well as a lot of other bumblebees. It's been in the news and everything else. This species is interesting because like other bumblebees, it's been impacted by a virus, we believe, as well as other things like climate change and habitat loss, pesticide use. But what's interesting about this species is it's parasitized by the variable cuckoo bumblebee, which also seems to be in decline. So watch more for that on that species. I'll mention here that when the service receives a petition to list a species, we assign an office to be the lead. And then after, or if it is listed, there's an office that's the lead on it. So my office is taking the lead on reviewing the petition for the American bumblebee, which is another huge effort because it's a wide-ranging species. So stay tuned on that there. So threatened species. All right, so these are species that are threatened with the potential of becoming an endangered species, basically. And typically species are on the list because of loss of habitat, but as I'll talk about later, that's not always the case. The Eastern Massasauga was a species that was a candidate for quite a long time, actually. But it was put on the federal list in 2016. It's state endangered as well, and was state endangered for a long time before it was put on the federal list. Recovery planning is underway. The service changed our recovery planning. I should mention, when we list the species, we write a recovery plan, and it's a plan to try to figure out how to recover the species with recovery criteria and how we want the species to be distributed across the range to make sure that it's being represented and things like that, and will also survive even if there's a catastrophic event or something that knocks out a large part of the range of the species. So we now, when we do recovery planning, we write a recovery plan, which kind of covers how we think the species should recover as far as how it should be distributed, certain number of species within certain conservation units or ranges. And then after we have that, now what we do is we write a recovery implementation schedule. We used to do it all in one document. We're doing them separately now because to change the recovery criteria, the things to determine that it's recovered, is a process where we have to go through public comment and things like that and advertise it in the Federal Register. We can add recovery actions, things to help recover the species without having to go through all those steps. So by having a separate document, we can update things to help recover the species, which sometimes we don't learn about until after the species is listed and we started doing a lot of research on the species. So it's actually a really beneficial thing. It gives us a lot more opportunity to add those recovery actions and get more partners involved. I have to mention that we do not recover species on our own as an agency. We totally rely on entities like the Conservation Foundation, other state and federal agencies, universities, non-government organizations, environmental groups, individual landowners, you name it. So it takes a village. The Massasauga, one of the things that was interesting with it is highly endangered in Illinois. I put this at the top of the threatened species because it could be one considered as extirpated in Northeast Illinois. We have some sites where we think they might be functionally extirpated. And what I mean by that is that the numbers in that particular population have reached a level that they're so low that they're not going to recover on their own without either being augmented with more individuals being added to the population or some other very extreme effort, but it's almost always requires more individuals. So we have had that in some sites in Illinois where we determined that the numbers were so low after doing mark recapture studies for years and collected those individuals that were still left in a population so that we could then bring them in a zoo population and have them start breeding in captivity along with snakes that are found within the American Zoological Association's network of zoos. So this is right now our understanding of the Massasauga's status in Illinois. I hate to say it, but it's likely true that it's probably even worse than this map shows. So we are working with zoos to try to help build up the zoo population with that. The Eastern Prairie Fringed Orchid is another federally threatened species. It's state threatened as well. Was known from 33 counties in Illinois, now only 9 counties. Although Northeast Illinois is where the largest concentration of the species occurs across the range of the species. And it's really, like most species, is threatened by the loss of habitat. But it also struggles because of lack of pollination. It's pollinated by hawk moths. And so one of the things that we do as a recovery effort is we do monitor the species, but what I should include here is when we monitor, we also hand pollinate the species. And we've even gone so far in recent years to move pollen around from site to site so that we're making sure that we're maintaining the genetic diversity of the species. We also have site stewards out there. A lot of the monitoring and stewardship is done by volunteers, which we're very thankful for. And then there are researchers here. Some of you may know or remember Marlon Bowles, who worked at Morton Arboretum and did a lot of research on the Eastern Prairie Fringed Orchid. Kathy Pollock is my counterpart in my office, and our office is the national lead on the Eastern Prairie Fringed Orchid, and Kathy has that role as the lead biologist for the species. So she's responsible for recovering it, not just in Northeast Illinois, but across the entire range. The prairie bush clover is another threatened species, and there's only 4 populations we know of in Illinois. 2 are in McHenry County and 1 is in DuPage. As far as Northeast Illinois, it occurs on thin soils with bedrock outcrops. There's not like a single species assemblage for this species, but does seem to be associated with a lot of prairie species throughout its range. The lakeside daisy, certainly a unique species. It occurs on these globally rare dolomitic prairies. And its name comes from Lakeside, Ohio, which some people don't know. That's why the L is capitalized. all the time. And so it occurs in 2 locations in Will County as a result of reintroduction efforts. And its habitat is globally rare on dolomitic prairie. Pitcher's thistle is another threatened species in Illinois. It's endemic to the Western Great Lakes and requires active sand dune processes. Highest ranked occurrences are in large, intact, active dunes. Vulnerable to habitat loss. Reintroductions are ongoing at Illinois Beach State Park. This is a species that we were ready to delist. We thought it had reached the numbers and achieved its recovery goals, that we could take it off its list. If you go to dunes in Michigan, you have a pretty good chance of seeing the species if you take a look around at those large intact sites. But as we were thinking about delisting it, this new threat came about, the seed weevil, which was introduced to control Canada thistle out west and found its way to the Midwest, and now is impacting the pitcher's thistle as well. So there's research underway to try to understand what those impacts are and how significant they are. The northern long-eared bat is a species that's threatened, but what's interesting about it is it's not listed because of habitat loss. It's listed because of white nose syndrome. You may have heard about it or seen about white nose syndrome in the news. It's impacting a lot of bat species, unfortunately, and really impacting the northern long-eared bat. I should specify cave species. That's where they come in contact with this fungus, and it is impacting a lot of species. And the white nose syndrome was found in Illinois caves in 2014. I won't try to say the name of the fungus, but the name is there on the screen for you. And because it wasn't listed because of habitat loss, I'll mention here that when the way the state of Illinois, for example, and the federal government regulates threatened endangered species a little different. So we protect the species and its habitat when its habitat is occupied. So whereas the state law really is about strictly protecting the species. So and so, for example, here, since we typically are all of us focused on that habitat loss issue, and that's not the reason northern long-eared bat's listed, the service has the authority to have these 4D rules for threatened species only, not for endangered species. And what it means is we're going to regulate this particular species a little bit differently. So with the northern long-eared bat, for example, we are really mostly just concerned about protecting its hibernaculum, which are caves and mines, or its roost trees. So maternity roost trees that are occupied. So it's really pretty limited. So we're not worried about every exfoliating tree that's out there. We're worried about the ones that are occupied. So it's kind of closer to the way the state regulates the species in that way. And what that does is it relieves some of the regulatory burden on the public, and also allows us to focus on higher priorities for the species. Rufa Red Knot's another threatened species, doesn't breed in Illinois, but definitely migrates through. It's listed because of loss of habitat, but also reduced food availability. This increased frequency of these mismatches or asynchronies, where basically the food isn't available when the species is in that particular habitat. Horseshoe crabs are its main food source, And so these asynchronies are happening as a result of climate change. We're seeing that as well with um, pollinators and flowering plants, where the pollinators show up and the plants aren't flowering yet, or vice versa. And so it is a real problem for many different species. There's also concerns about increase in predation in its Arctic breeding grounds. So as I mentioned, it has this huge range, 25 countries, 40 states. Some of them migrate as far as 9,300 miles each way. And so this little bit busy of a graphic here, which you can find online, really kind of gives you an idea all the way from Tierra del Fuego all the way up to the Arctic that they can migrate. So now we'll talk about endangered species before we finish things up. So here's a rusty patch bumblebee, a fairly recently added endangered species in our area. The numbers for this bumblebee, along with a lot of other bumblebees, have dropped drastically. With the rusty patch, we estimate about 87% decline across its historic range. Although I will say they seem to be holding on pretty well in Northeast Illinois. Touch on that a little bit later. It was considered abundant across its 28 states where its historic range is. And now it's down to just these 13 states, but Illinois is one of them. Excuse me, it does need areas that support a lot of nectar and pollen from flowers. Early spring, I emphasize this again later, but it's really important. University of Illinois just came out with a paper that really showed how important that these early flowering plants are to bumblebees, especially rusty patch, which seems to have this kind of longer season. The queens come out in April, we believe. And so especially when we have these cold springs, it can really limit the nectar that's available for them. So if you can, try to plant those early flowering plants. And then also its nesting habitat's really important for overwintering, as well as the summer habitat. The summer burrow, they seem to use mammal burrows in particular for their summer habitat. And then overwintering queens use these undisturbed soils. And so far, we only have a couple records, but it's been on these forest edges. So not just in open prairie like we might typically think of seeing bumblebees in. Again, it is threatened because of loss of habitat, but other threats like pathogens from introduced commercial honeybees and bumblebees, contaminants, pesticides, climate change, and possibly some other things that we're still trying to figure out. It is interesting, though, again, that they need these early flowering plants. They need these undisturbed areas to burrow in, and pesticide and disease free, which may be why, that, as I tried to highlight at the bottom here, why scientists are finding that the diversity of bees is often higher in metropolitan areas than in rural areas, possibly because we're not spraying broad spectrum kind of spraying of pesticides typically in metropolitan areas. So they do seem to be holding on in some of our remnants here in Northeast Illinois. The whooping crane is a interesting species. It's the tallest bird in North America, but it does come through our area, sometimes associated with or migrating with sandhill cranes. This is one of the fun things I think about the species, is that there are people that dress up like whooping cranes so that they can help rear the juveniles, and then teach them to migrate. So the person actually gets up in these ultralight planes and migrates with them, as well as, you know, feeding them while they're before they make that migration. It is considered a non-essential experimental population that we have in the Midwest. And this kind of busy slide here explains what that is, but basically what it is it's a regulatory way that allows us to reintroduce the species within its historic range, but tries to alleviate some of the concerns that the public might have from being regulated on the species. So it does relax the rules a little bit, kind of like that 4D rule that I mentioned, that we have for threatened species, but this is an endangered species. And so what we're saying to the public here is that we're going to reintroduce it here, but we are not going to regulate you with this reintroduced species as much as we would if it was a non-essential, if it was not a non-essential experimental population. We do reintroductions of other species, and those are regulated. So it needs to have the special non-essential experimental population designation. I shared this map that is a little bit older, as you can see, but I just wanted to really kind of show you how they do come through our area, and how important our area is for this species. So really important thing to think about when we're particular birds. It's kind of the locally, globally kind of thing that we've all heard over the years. And the piping plover is a good example of that right here too. There's currently, we think, about 68 pairs in the Great Lakes population. There's also Great Plains and Atlantic Coast population. We did designate critical habitat for the species in 2001, when the species hadn't been nesting here at that time for about 19 years or so, maybe even longer, about 20 years, and which helped us to protect that species even though it was, or protect that habitat even though it wasn't occupied. But then we did have them nest in that designated critical habitat area in 2009 up at Illinois Beach State Park. And we did have to salvage those eggs, but the chicks were reared successfully. And then in 2015, we had our first successful nest with 3 chicks fledging. 2019, we had our first nest in Chicago proper at Montrose Beach. You may have seen in the news about Monty and Rose. There's been a lot. There's even a documentary out there about that pair. And so 2019, they fledged a very busy beach that does not fit at all what we thought of as critical habitat for the species. It's a busy beach. There's not a lot of cobble. There's a lot of places for predators to perch, all the things that we would think as being unattractive to the species, but they decided to nest there. And they did so successfully. Their first, the first nest they had there had to be salvaged because it was flooded, but they nested again within about a week's time. They set up the next nest and started laying eggs. And they did have 2 chicks that fledged that year. Then last year, they had 3 chicks fledged successfully. And one of those chicks helped with the first nest in Ohio in 80 years, the male Nish. And so just kind of shows how that kind of locally, globally thing, how it really contributes to our local efforts have contributed to the species recovery range wide. This bottom picture here really shows one of the reasons why this species is threatened. It really blends in well with the cobble, and why you can imagine why it typically wants the cobble on its beaches. So we go through great efforts to protect those nests. The Sheepnose Mussel is another endangered species in our area, and mussels are really interesting. They can survive for 100, 200 years. They have this interesting life history where the females release Lycaeides, which are then picked up by fish because it looks like eggs. The Lycaeides then attaches to the gills of the fish until they develop enough as juveniles, and then they are released. So the fish actually help distribute those Lycaeides around and help the species of mussel get distributed. So that's just one of the interesting things here that I highlight in these slides. The leafy prairie clover is another endangered species in our area. It occurs in several locations in Northeast Illinois and Will County and Kane County, including at Meadii National Tallgrass Prairie. We do have an active recovery effort for the species in Illinois. And in fact, we're doing so well in Illinois that we've reached some of the recovery goals for our part of the range and are exceeding other parts of the range in that part. One of the ways that we did that is by protecting areas where they flower so that they aren't, so that herbivory is limited. And in partnership with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, DuPage and Will County Forest Preserve Districts, as well as Meadii, who helped propagate a bunch of leafy prairie clover, we augmented and reintroduced the species successfully at a number of sites. So that's really helped reach those goals for Illinois. And then finally, last but not least, is the Hines emerald dragonfly. And I say that in part because it's another species at my office that has the national lead on. And I have the privilege and role of being a national biologist to work on the recovery of this species. So here you'll see on the left is a female or mama Hines emerald dragonfly. The male Hines emerald dragonfly, you can tell by the differences in their abdomen. Hines has this clasp at the end that helps it when they're copulating, but the males can also remove sperm from other males that may have copulated with that female, which might contribute to multiple paternity within a clutch of eggs, and why, even though Illinois has such a small population, why it's still highly genetically diverse. And then here on the right is a larvae of Hines. This is one that's in captivity. Normally they do not look this clean. What you can see on there are the little hairs on it, which is unique to Hines larvae and enables them to survive drought periods, which they'll certainly need this summer. They also take advantage of crayfish burrows for surviving those drought periods and for overwintering. They go down into crayfish burrows. We think of only the devil crayfish at this point that they use. It's the only federally listed dragonfly. It's known to occur in the lower Des Plaines River Valley until 2014, where we also found it up in Northwest Cook County. And I think we had somebody join from Winnebago County. We do now have records in Winnebago County as well. So we're really excited about that and just starting to work on recovery there for the species. Excuse me. The Illinois population, as I mentioned, is the second most genetically diverse and has these 4 unique haplotypes. But it is extremely small and vulnerable to extirpation. There's only 86 to 313 adults, we think, in a given year. And most of those emerge from just 2 sites. And it's reliant on groundwater to feed its habitat. So as I mentioned, if that groundwater dries up, it can be detrimental to the species. It does, these sites typically do dry up for a couple of weeks out of the year, and it has adapted, as I showed in that with that picture of the larvae, to survive those drought periods. But anything longer than a few weeks can lead to mortality. So we have started a captive rearing program for the species. We think that less than 1% survive from egg to adult in the wild, and it's probably even lower, on the order of maybe just a 1/10% that actually make it that far. We see much higher numbers in our captive rearing program. We recently moved to mass rearing. So the survival rates are a little bit lower, but we're also able to rear much greater numbers. The protocol for developing that captive rearing methodology was developed at the University of South Dakota, who's a key partner in a lot of the Heinz Emerald dragonfly work that we do. The Genoa National Fish Hatchery, one of the Fish and Wildlife Service units up in Genoa, Wisconsin, started with the mass rearing along with DuPage County Forest Preserve at their Urban Stream Research Center. That was a few years ago, and just got news this week that our efforts were successful. And then Jake Wolf Fish Hatchery, which is a little bit further downstate, run by the DNR, is now not only rearing the dragonfly, but also has taken on rearing the devil crayfish, which DuPage County Forest Preserve is leading that effort for us, so that when we restore sites for the species, we have habitat for it to use. And we're also working with private landowners and government agencies on that, and they've granted approval for collecting and releasing on their properties. We're working with other entities like Brookfield Zoo, who's expressed interest in participating in this captive rearing effort. DuPage is always doing more, so that's why I listed them there again. And then also looking to NGOs to help us administer and raise funds for the captive rearing program. We're always working on grant funds that are just a couple years old. And I didn't mention earlier, but this species is in a larval stage for about 5 years. So we need more than a couple of years of funding for a captive rearing program to be successful. So that's all that I have for you. And I open it up to any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Kris. There was so much information there. That was really great. I'm taking notes. Wanted to mention a couple of things. First off, I put a link to the Monty and Rose documentary in the chat. So cool. I was fortunate enough to see it during Wild Things, and it's fantastic. So definitely check that out if you get a chance to. If you're interested in learning more about mussels and that Glaucidia and that whole process with the fish, it is so bizarre in my opinion. It's so unique to that creature. But in a previous webinar on the Fox River, we had, I can't think of her name, Pam something, who works with groups on the Fox River. She talked about it and talked about all kinds of wildlife along the Fox River. And she had a whole video showing how that worked. And it was really neat. So if you go on our YouTube channel, just search our videos for Fox River, you'll find her presentation. It was fantastic. Cool. And then also we had a dragonfly specialist on not too long ago, and she talked all about, especially about the larval stages of dragonflies, which was really interesting. So check that webinar out as well if you're interested in learning more about dragonflies. Okay, enough of me plugging my past webinars. Quick little funny story. I did a webinar on sandhill cranes back in the spring, and talking about the migration and everything. And so of course I have sandhill cranes, and then I also talk a little bit about whooping cranes in there too, since they migrate together. I am driving along and I see this large white bird with black wingtips landing in a field. And I'm like, oh, I turned the car around wherever I was going, forget it. I turned the car around, pulled into a parking lot, called my husband to come bring me some binoculars. It was a snow goose.
Oh. Well, I will say, I work on a lot of these species and I never get to see them. So I handed to some of you, mentioned some species that I haven't gotten to see yet myself, and I work on their recovery. So
yeah, it's unfortunate that there are so many endangered things out there, but so good that steps are being taken to preserve them.
Yeah.
It was a snow goose. It was not, sorry, Carol. Yeah, it was a snow goose. I thought for sure it was a whooping crane because I had it on the brain and I saw the black wingtips and I'm like, and I guess forgot snow geese existed or something in that moment. So even went out to
Understandable.
Jasper, Pulaski, hoping to see him there, and there wasn't one there the day that we were there. So, oh well. So I'd like to talk for just a minute about monarchs. So anybody who knows me knows I am the butterfly lady. I, have raised monarchs for, yeah, you see my butterflies here. I have raised monarchs for educational purposes. We do a lot of environmental ed at the Conservation Foundation. So, so I am the butterfly lady. And so with the listing of monarchs or the discussion around that, I was really torn because on the one hand, great, more protections, but on the other hand, those of us who, do some captive rearing and things may not be able to do so anymore. It seems like there's both pros and cons to that. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think that, there was supposed to be a listing decision. I think it was in early 2020, maybe, right? And then it was pushed back, interestingly enough, to December 2020. And a lot of things happened over that time period. So I thought the timing was interesting for that. I will say this, that sometimes species get put on the candidate list, like the Massasauga, and we're overwhelmed, like most conservation organizations, right? So we have to prioritize what we're working on. So the Massasauga was a candidate for a number of years. We did work on it, and we always encouraged recovery, and fortunately it was state listed, so the state was leading a lot of efforts too, when we were kind of along for the ride to be a good partner. I don't see that happening with the monarch. It's such a charismatic species. I mean, most people, there's a species that most everybody's seen at some point. You may have even seen a caterpillar, right? I know my kids have seen caterpillars. And so I don't see it going away. There's a lot of interest. There's a lot of efforts underway. And I know that the service is paying a lot of attention to it. As an agency, I cut out some of the details out of this presentation because I had so much, but even going back to President Obama, back in 2014, there was a lot of efforts at that point, to not only within the US, but with Canada and Mexico, to work on recovery of not only monarch, but other pollinators. I see this monarch as being one of those species that's going to be like the flagship too, that really draws attention to pollinators. So I'm right there with you in a lot of ways, believe me. But I do wholeheartedly believe that the service, my agency, is going to continue its efforts. So much had already been going on when we're working on this listing, these candidate conservation agreements that I mentioned. And it's really led the states to take on a lot of effort too, because they don't have them state listed. And the states don't like to be caught off guard where we list a species and now they have to list it all of a sudden. So I know, like Illinois, for example, has, a lot of efforts underway as well at the state level.
Yeah, that habitat preservation is just so crucial. And that's part of the reason here at the Conservation Foundation, we promote not only native plants through our Conservation at Home program, but also anytime somebody's looking to put in native plants, milkweed is always in there, because the more milkweed we can get out there, the more stems we get out there, the more habitat, the more food they're going to have. So
And most of them are really easy to grow. So why
Yeah.
not?
Oh, yeah. I have common milkweed taking over my rain garden at the moment, and I'm not mad about it. So, but no, that's an interesting point too, because um, another question we get asked all the time is about bees and people wanting to, plant native plants for the pollinators, and because they heard about the plight of the bees. And a lot of times they're meaning honeybees because that's what they hear about, and no bees, no food, all this marketing propaganda that was out there. But as you and I both know, honeybees aren't even native here. And but I find myself not really correcting them, because if they can
Right.
be compassionate towards honeybees and that encourages them to plant more flowers and plant more things, it's the native bees that we're more concerned about, but they're still going to benefit either way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a tough one too. Because I totally hear you. And yeah, anything that really, for the most part, things that will benefit honeybees will benefit bumblebees. The problem, or one why I struggle with it little bit is they can also introduce some of those parasites too. And so what we try to do is um, avoid anyway encouraging putting honeybee hives in places where we know um, rusty patch bumblebee occurs. And so with rusty patch, we've done something a little bit different where we have maps out there now. It doesn't show the exact location of the record, but it shows these high potential zones. So we'll take a record that we have and then we'll buffer out from there based on what we know the ranges for a particular, for an individual bumblebee or a nest. And then we try to regulate within that area because they are pretty much generalists. They don't, they will nectar on a lot of different species, even some like dandelions and impatiens and things like that. So which we're not necessarily encouraging those, but definitely, yeah. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in some ways there, but yeah, I hear you. I mean, for the most part, when it comes to planting, certainly.
Yeah, and that's most of the questions we get. We don't hear too much from too many beekeepers, but most of the people are like, oh, I heard about the plight of the pollinators. I want to help. What can I plant in my yard that will help the bees? It's like,
Yeah.
okay, we're going to take that bees as general, and that's fine. Yep, here's all the great things. Let's plant Monarda. Let's plant all these great things that the bees
Right.
like.
The cool thing too, that because you're in outreach and everything, and is that is how bumblebees are really important to our food source too, right? Like without bumblebees, we don't have tomatoes, and it's this whole buzz pollination that they do, that so there's a lot of interesting things like that too that we try to get out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It comes down to that charismatic megafauna that we hear so much about, that one thing that people can really latch onto, but by helping that one, I always like the expression, a rising tide lifts all ships.
Yeah.
So if
Right.
you're latched onto this one, and so you're going to do things to help this guy, but that actually helps everybody else in the process.
Yeah, and that's true a lot with endangered species. In fact, I try to remind people that one of the purposes defined in the Endangered Species Act is to protect the ecosystems upon which species depend, not just the individual species. Because if there's no ecosystem, we all know the rest. So yeah.
That's a great point. All right, let's get some questions. I could sit here and quiz you like all day on stuff, but all right. So Ellen wants to know that the Prairie Fringed Orchid is that the same as the White Fringed Orchid? Is that the same thing?
Yes. So there's a Western Prairie Fringed Orchid and an Eastern Prairie Fringed Orchid. So that's why we specify, but they look really similar. Unless you're a botanist or somebody that studies them, you'll have a hard time telling them apart. They do overlap the range a little bit. Like in Missouri, just a few years ago, we got some Eastern Prairie Fringed Orchid, and they hadn't even been known there for a long time. So, but yeah, so sometimes people refer to them as white fringe or the prairie fringed orchids. Yeah.
She also wants to know, how do the hairs on the Heinz Emerald Dragonfly nymph help with drought situations?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, because I just kind of glossed over that. So yeah, those hairs basically help them retain water. So I mentioned that they're groundwater dependent. And so the usually in these systems where they occur is the groundwater seeps out into the fen, and it'll create either these little streamlet systems that are only like 6 inches foot wide, 6 inches deep. Sometimes it'll be more of a sheet flow through an area and through hummocks and things like that. But they need to be in the water. The eggs are laid, they call it oviposing when the females lay the eggs, are laid in the water. And then with Heinz, those eggs overwinter. So they need to stay wet throughout the entire winter because they're not getting down into the burrows. They just lay the eggs in the streamlet system. And then they overwinter and hatch the next spring. So they then are out there as larvae for, as I mentioned, for 4 to 5 years. We think we've even had some in captivity for 6 years before they reached maturity. And they need to survive these kind of drought periods. So one of the things that happens in its habitat is they typically do dry up for a week, 2 weeks. When the species was first discovered in Illinois and we were learning about it, the researchers panicked, like, oh my gosh, the habitat dried up. We just lost the species we rediscovered in Illinois. And but it seems to be the natural cycle in these systems. Excuse me. If it does extend more than a few weeks, it can cause mortality, and it seems to impact the crayfish too. So they have these hairy bodies that help them to retain water. In these little streamlet systems, they have to be really slow flowing and typically just fed by the groundwater, because that allows detritus to build up in these systems too. And the larvae can get underneath there and survive these drought periods. And then, as I mentioned before too, they'll go down into the crayfish burrows to overwinter and to survive these drought periods. So other crayfish don't seem to have these adaptations using the crayfish burrows, having these hairy bodies as larvae. And in fact, in sites where we find Heinz, even though it is an endangered species, it's often one of the more abundant dragonfly species in its habitat.
Carol has a question here that I think is absolutely fantastic and has been kind of a hot button issue in many circles here. She wants to know, what are your thoughts about municipalities spraying for mosquitoes in relationship to monarchs and rusty patch bumblebees and others? If the species are listed as endangered, could that change mosquito spraying guidelines?
Yeah, it's something that we're trying to learn more about because we can't regulate unless we've got the science there to support us. But
Yeah, of course.
I hear the question, believe me, I hear what you're asking, and I'm right there with you. And so we've definitely tried to do that. Even you may recall there was much more efforts, for example, some years ago with gypsy moth control. That was a concern that we had because the orchid being pollinated by a moth. And what does that do to other Lepidoptera even?
Sure.
Like butterflies. So in those cases, we try to work with those entities that are going to be doing that spraying, try to avoid exposure any way we can by either not spraying in a particular area. Maybe the timing of the spraying can be done so that it doesn't impact them. There was some hope that, like with the mosquito spraying, typically it's done at dusk. So we were hopeful that that would avoid impacts to the bumblebee, but we're not really certain that's the case because we do see them active at dusk.
Sure.
And again, in these metropolitan areas where they seem to be holding on. So we're definitely keeping an eye on that, but until we have the science, we just can't regulate it. But we can ask people to at least be cooperative and hear us out as we try to study more. Maybe they can even cooperate by sharing some science that they have with us, or at least try to avoid exposure.
I'd honestly be really curious to see if these mosquito spraying programs are even really that effective in what they're trying to do, because I don't think I've seen any evidence of that even.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, probably you and others on your call know even more about this than I do, but one of the reasons people are concerned about mosquitoes is not just the annoying bites that we get and the itching, but because of West Nile. And really with West Nile virus, from what I understand, the mosquitoes that carry West Nile are usually breed in water that's stagnant water that we have sitting in our yard, in an old tire or a wheelbarrow or a bucket that's collected water. It's not typically in our nice wetlands that these particular mosquitoes. So I hear you. I mean, really, we can probably achieve more by just making sure we're not collecting water and we're keeping our gutters clean and those kind of things. So there's not habitat for the ones that carry the West Nile.
Exactly. All right. I think that is all of the questions that we have. Thank you so much. This has been really, really interesting. And I know I learned so much. I love talking with other researchers and naturalists and people, because I always end up learning more too. So tons and tons of really great information on this. So thank you so much for being here today. We really, really appreciate you helping us out with this and being here today. And I will have this up on YouTube later today. But thank you all for watching today, and thank you for joining us. And we hope to see you all back again next week.
I just want to say thank you as well. Thank you for having me. Thank you for participating. And I am a public employee. I can be found on the internet as well as my phone number. So if you have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to contact me.
And any emails that you got about this webinar, go to my email address. So I can also help you reach him. So thanks again. Take care, everybody, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.